Hi, everyone. My name is Mercedes Lipinski, and today I'm going to be giving you guys a book talk on the book Writing with Mentors: How to Reach Every Writer in the Room Using Current Engaging Mentor Texts. It is by Allison Marchetti and Rebecca Odell. So, a few things that I will touch upon during this book talk. One, I'm just going to give obviously a brief overview of what the book is about and what mentor texts are. Then we're going to talk into why we should use mentor texts. We're going to talk about units of study, so suggested ways to develop units of study around mentor texts, which Marchetti and Odell use the majority of the book to talk about. And so that was kind of my main focus because I felt like it was the most useful for everybody. And then the reflection piece, so some discussion questions based on writing with mentors. Mentor texts enable all of us, teachers and students alike, to do far more than we could ever do on our own. That is Marchetti and Odell really just on the purpose of writing with mentor texts. All right, so overview. Writing with mentors is it's exactly as it sounds. Allison Marchetti and Rebecca Odell provide their readers with the tools to incorporate mentor texts into every stage of the writing process, emphasizing the importance of student engagement and choice in the classroom. So they spend much of this this book really talking about and teaching teachers how to pick mentor texts, why they should use mentor texts, and how to create what they call units of study. And they then also go deeper into using mentor texts for the specific parts of the writing process. So beyond just teaching a technique, they talk about using it for drafting, revising, and publishing. But the main focus, what I have chosen to really talk about, is how to incorporate mentor texts into your lessons about writing. So, what are mentor texts? They are model pieces of writing or excerpts of writing by established authors that can inspire students and teach them how to write. They're usually very relevant, modern, current things that are going to really engage students in the writing process. And they are like the best of, they're the exemplar of a technique that you want to teach your students. So first off, why mentor texts? Why should we use them in our classroom? Odell and Marchetti mention a variety of reasons that cover things like connection, independence, creativity, differentiation, and choice. So connection, they're basically saying that with mentor texts, student writers become connected to the world of professional writers. And it helps reinforce that idea that the world is full of writers, and that writers aren't just novelists and journalists, that there are many different kinds of writers, many different kinds of writing. It promotes independence. So eventually down the road, the idea is that what you do with mentor texts, students will be able to do on their own with their own favorite authors and books and texts and magazines. So the skills and the techniques that you study and the way that you pull things out is going to help students to do that on their own. Differentiation and choice they go a little bit hand in hand. So differentiation is this idea that with mentor texts, it allows you to reach every writer in the room, wherever the writer is in a process, with whatever the writer needs. And so, for example, if you're working on critical reviews, there is a critical review that could interest every student. It could be a review on a movie, it could be a review on a book, but you're hitting the different interests and different needs of students. And then mentor texts also provide choice. So they provide choice in topic, process, and mentor text as like in general. So students should be able to, with mentor text, they're picking kind of what they want to write about. So, they're picking their topic and they're just using techniques that they've learned from these mentor texts to write about a topic of their choice. They have a choice in process. So Marchetti and Odell stress that you need to allow students to get to a deadline their own way. So they say that everybody in their classroom has the same deadline for a piece, but the way that they draft that piece and create that piece is different for everybody. Does give me some anxiety a little bit, but that is how they run their classroom. So they don't have like, your rough draft is due this day. You need to have an outline on this day. They allow students to approach writing in the way that they want to approach it because we all write differently, which I get. And then choice in mentor text. So if they're all writing a critical review of something, students get to choose the mentor text that they're most interested in to help guide writing their own critical review. There. So another reason why we should use mentor texts in the classroom, according to Marchetti and Odell, is that they help support students in every phase of writing. So the first phase that Marchetti and Odell introduce is this phase called play. And really that's just, the time where you're dabbling with different writing techniques. And so mentor texts help support students in this phase by helping them dream up new topics, helps them, they say, complicate old ideas. So probably, rethink things or think about something in a different way. Discover new sentence possibilities, discover a new approach to writing in a certain genre. And so, students can use mentor text to play around with the way that they write. It helps in the planning process. So again, it can help students generate new ideas or give life to some old ideas. Help them find a structure to begin writing. It helps them focus on tone and audience in a given genre, and it can help them understand features and techniques in a specific genre. So when they're planning on writing their book review, using a mentor text that is a book review helps to see the elements that they need. It helps to see the kind of tone that they should have, the audience they should expect, those kinds of things. Drafting, it helps students keep the big picture in mind. So this is, mentor texts are great. So when they're, writing that book review and they're, if they go back to their mentor text, it can help remind them of their end goal and how they should be putting their review together. It helps them shape theme and purpose, helps them experiment with form, troubleshoot writing struggles, find additional examples of interesting craft. So it can help them to diversify the way that they write and, put together a strong piece of writing. And then the last phase of writing that Marchetti and Odell bring up is preparing to publish or preparing for readers. They kind of use both here. And so this mentor text can help writers discover different ways of publishing work, creating subsections and sections to organize content, and identifying mechanical and grammatical errors. So, they're really saying mentor texts can help show students what you want them to do. And that usually kind of, that's something that clicks more in a student's head than you just telling them this is what you should do. Okay, So we're going to dive into what Marchetti and Odell call units of study. And so they spend a huge chunk of this book going through how to incorporate mentor texts into your classroom. And they say that you need to do this by developing units of study. And we all know that you develop units in a classroom, but this they're looking at, there's a specific way to do this, and there are a bunch of steps that they say you should take into consideration. So first off, when you are developing a unit of study, there are certain conditions for using mentor texts that your classroom should meet. So first off, space and time for writing. Marchetti and Odell really stress the workshop model because students can access resources, they can experiment with techniques from a daily writing lesson, they can get peer feedback, and they can confer with the teacher. So versus, writing at home alone, they have all of these really great things that they can access by using that workshop model in your classroom. Units of study. So we're going to go deeper into this specifically, but Marchetti and Odell talk about, a classroom that uses mentor texts needs to be a classroom that teaches writing instruction through units of study versus units that are around literature. So for example, my classroom all of my units are based around literature. I have an American Dream unit that I developed based around The Great Gatsby. I have a social injustice unit based around the book Homegoing. And so when I was reading this, I had a hard time I don't know if I had a hard time relating or if I just had a hard time thinking about it, because my classroom is my units are structured around literature versus what they call units of study. And like I said, we'll get more into that. And then you also need to make sure, again, you have choice for your writers. Students are able to choose their topic, the process, and mentor texts. And those are the conditions they say work best in a classroom that uses mentor texts. If you want to use mentor texts, these are the things that you need to consider. All right, so the question of the day here: how can an entire unit of study be planned around mentor texts? There are 6 steps, and we are going to dive deeply into each one. So step 1 is to decide on a writing unit. Step 2, collect mentor texts. Step 3, study patterns to create lessons. Step 4, arrange those lessons into a unit. Step 5, teach. And step 6, confer and study patterns in student writing. You are not quite done after you hit the teach thing. There's a little bit more. All right, so let's dive into each one of these. Step 1, deciding on writing a unit. So Odell and Marchetti give an anchor question for each one of these steps. So I kept these in here because I thought that they were really great and really important when considering how to shape a unit of study. So the anchor question for this step is, what kinds of writing do my students need to study? And what kinds of writing are my students interested in studying? And those 2 questions, the answers to those 2 questions should shape each of your writing units. So when you are developing a writing unit, Marchetti and Odell say that you should plan around one of 4 things: a genre, a technique, a student interest or need, or a mentor text. So when you plan around a genre, this is where you show students a variety of texts that are all within a specific genre. So, that genre could be a critical review, it could be a memoir, it could be an editorial, it could be an infographic. And so you're picking different examples, let's say, of memoirs that are strong in different elements of a memoir, right? So you might pick a text that is really strong in the in using imagery in that narrative story piece that a memoir needs to have, and then you might pick a text that is very good at that kind of reflective, what the person has learned, kind of a um, thing, that piece of that memoir that you need to, in order to show people the significance of what you're writing about. um, they do say when you are planning around a genre that all your genres must be real. They need to be found in the real world, written by professional writers. um, and you need to balance between the kinds of writing students will be academically successful in and real world writing. So you do need to, they say, you should hit literary analysis as a genre because that is um, a kind of writing that students are going to be academically successful in. But at the same time, you should, um, you know, also base it around editorials or infographics because those are genres that we see in the real world that students can easily connect to. The second and the one that I kind of related to the most, and I was like, oh, I could definitely do that in my classroom, is to plan around a technique. So this is when you show students a variety of mentor texts across genres, with each text displaying a different element of the same technique. So, for example, if you're talking about, let's say evidence, you're showing different mentor texts across genres where authors do a great job incorporating evidence, backing up their points, those kinds of things. Odell and Marchetti say that this is a really good focus for classes like AP and IB courses because technically students do a lot of one type of writing, like literary analysis. If you're taking AP Lit, that is what you do, is literary analysis. And so they say that by planning around a technique, you can use mentor texts because you are planning around analyzing for themes. So you're picking up mentor texts to do a really great job with theme. Or you're analyzing for character. So you're picking mentor texts that are really good at character. So this was really the plan that I could really get around. Another item they say that you could plan around is planning around a student interest or need. So they say this is usually left for lessons later on in the year when you know what your students want to study and what they need to study. And these are very beneficial because they help to increase student engagement. So they say that when you're going into developing your year, that you want to save like later lessons for and keep them kind of open for things that students might be interested in learning. Like they give an example where one of the teachers decided to plan a unit on satire because she noticed that a lot of her students like to read The Onion. So that was one of those kind of later interests planned around a student interest. And then lastly, you can also plan around a mentor text. And so this is also something that I see myself doing a lot. And it's, when you find a text that you think is a phenomenal example of a technique or a genre, and so you can do that. They say it's the same as planning around a genre or a technique, but you're planning backwards. So instead of starting with the genre you want or starting with the technique you want, you're looking at that mentor text and you're saying, okay, what techniques or what genre can I teach using this text, and kind of plan backwards from there. All right. So once you have figured out what you're going to do your writing unit on, you need to collect the mentor texts that would work. So the anchor question for this is, how can I create a cluster of mentor texts to enhance students' understanding of a genre or a technique while demonstrating a range of writing possibilities? Mentor texts are all around you all the time, especially in places you read every day. So the one thing that Marchetti and Odell really stress is that when you're finding mentor text, it shouldn't be a laborious task. It should be something that you do just kind of when you're reading for pleasure, or when you're looking at other things that you read during the day. So, some people just, there are certain websites that they read every day. And so they say when you're doing that, you should keep an eye out for mentor texts and things that you can use versus, spending hours and hours on end trying to find mentor texts for a certain thing. They say, you should collect them as you go, and then you can kind of piecemeal and sort them into where you want them to be. So for finding mentor texts, they say ask yourself the following questions. What reading interests you? What do you pick up and read throughout the day? What are your favorite magazines, newspapers, and websites? And then what elements of those might inspire your students? So it's really finding things that you finding mentor texts in places that you go to read things every day. So when you are choosing a mentor text to add to a writing unit or a unit of study, Marchetti and Odell say to ask yourself the following questions. So first off, does it pass the highlighter test? So what does that mean? They say that this is a text that makes you want to mark up the pages and take notes on all the teaching possibilities. It's one of those texts that you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. They say that these kinds of texts tend to be thoughtful, intentional, and human in their writing. They have a strong sense of voice. The writing has what they call a sense of music, so it's like it has a rhythm to it. It's maybe alliterative. It's got a flow. They usually use words in a surprising or playful way. They have a meaningful structure and progression of ideas, highly imaginative, and contain persuasive, engaging, and moving ideas. So does your mentor text cover all of that? Does it pass that highlighter test? The next question they say to think about is the text accessible? So thinking about the capabilities of your students and how much you want to challenge them. Marchetti and Odell say that you shouldn't disregard a text based on challenge. They say you can scaffold, but their general rule of thumb is that if making sense of a text is going to require so much effort that students lose interest before they even get to read it as writers, you shouldn't use it. If it's going to take just too much scaffolding, then it's not something you want to use, because you want your students to have interest in the text, because that's how mentor texts really work, is that engagement piece. The next one is looking at how long the text is. And so while shorter texts are often more accessible, Odell and Marchetti say it's not, they're not going to cut out a piece because it's too long. What length does determine is how they introduce that text to their students. So this is the idea of a whole mentor text versus what they call a mini mentor text. So if they have if there's a 10-page text that they want to use because they love it, they might just use excerpts from that, and those are mini mentor texts. But if there's a text that's only 4 paragraphs long, then they would probably use that as a whole mentor text. They also say it determines when you do your first draft reading. So a longer mentor text tends to, they ask their students to do that out of class. So read it the night before, highlight things that stand out to you or interest you, and come in having read it with the pages marked up. Or if it's a shorter one, it can be an in-class mentor text, because they can do an in-text first draft reading because they can read it multiple times during the class because it's short enough. And then lastly, is it mentor text gold? And so what that means is that in addition to being engaging in content and form, the writer of the text uses the social mediums of the day. So like they're on Twitter, they've got a good social media presence. Students tend to respect writers who are technologically savvy and use technology to push their writing out to their audiences. The writer should also be somebody who publishes on a regular basis. I say that gives you the capability of following patterns in an author's writing as they go. So somebody, who publishes biweekly or monthly or something, you can use, you can use future texts of theirs. And then knowledgeable beyond his writing. So things like interviews, pictures, or quotes about the writing process from the writer humanizes the writer and their writing. So, they do interviews or, they talk about the writing process. They talk about things beyond just like their own pieces or, they have a more rounded presence. So those are the things you should consider when considering what mentor text to use in your classroom. So once you've collected your mentor text, step 3 is study the patterns to create lessons. So what combinations of skills would best serve my students in this study? So Marchetti and Odell say there are 3 basic kinds of lessons that they include in every writing study. Lessons on author's purpose, lessons on content organization and style, and lessons on grammar and usage. So when they're looking at their mentor text and deciding what lessons they're going to use that text for, they ask certain questions of these mentor texts. So when they're forming their lessons on author's purpose, they're asking, how is the author's purpose made clear in this text? How does the author support this purpose? When they're doing their lessons around content organization and style, they're asking questions like, how is this text organized and structured? How does it begin? How does it end? What are the parts of this text? What ideas and topics are explored? How are the shifts from one idea to the next marked? How does the writer make this writing compelling for the reader? And are there certain stylistic patterns that seem to be characteristic of this writer? And then when they're forming lessons around grammar and usage, they're asking, are there grammatical structures that are particularly useful to this genre? What punctuation might be useful for establishing a student's voice within this genre? And does this mentor use a particular tone or jargon? So asking those questions, they're able to say, okay, I'm going to use this mentor piece to talk about purpose. I'm going to use this mentor piece to talk about how their text is structured, those kinds of things. And then, sometimes they say you just have so many mentor texts that you really need to narrow mentor. They say you don't want to use too many mentor texts or you're going to overwhelm your students. So you need to ask some questions when choosing which techniques a mentor you can, when choosing which techniques make the cut. So like you can have a mentor text that gives, that has so many different techniques within it. You need to figure out, okay, you don't want to overwhelm your students by being like, we're going to learn about these 10 different techniques from this one mentor text. You need to figure out what techniques are going to make the cut. So what recurring patterns are present in this mentor text? Does this text use figurative language multiple times? If it does, that might be an important part of the genre that this writer is writing in. That's probably a technique that you want to focus on. What can this mentor text teach that others in this cluster cannot? So what's different about this mentor text? Like let's say in a genre study, like what does this mentor text do that others don't? What can you focus on in this one mentor text? Are there recurring patterns in mentor text across the cluster? So what is something that you can bring up in each mentor text that is obviously significant to the genre that you're working with? And then what can your students handle? What is their level and capability? And then thinking about, is this technique timely? Does it make sense in the broader sequence of lessons? So once you have studied kind of the patterns and figured out, okay, I'm going to do a lesson on voice and I'm going to do a lesson on figurative language, you need to arrange your lessons into a unit. So the anchor question for this is, how can I sequence my lessons in a way that will support student writing and anticipate the needs of writers as they move through a study? So when you are developing a unit, Marchetti and O'Dell tell you to consider the following guidelines for arranging lessons into a unit. They say that you should front load the unit with lessons on content and craft. You should then follow with lessons on structure and end with lessons that focus on conventions, kind of like how you develop a piece of writing. You start with ideas and then you move into how you're going to structure it, and then you do the punctuation and the grammar and all of that. They say that you should build on skills students have been taught in previous lessons, and you should also introduce skills that might bridge one study and the next. And then finally, you're ready to teach. Finally, step 5. How can I use mentor texts in writing lessons to engage students and teach them something about writing? So the big why, the big purpose for mentor texts is that they help show your writers what you tell them about during the instruction. And as I talked about this before, but that idea of showing versus telling is something that's going to click more in a student's head than just being like, these are the elements of a personal narrative. You also want to give those examples, like here is this person using these elements, and seeing that in action is really what is helpful to students, and that is why you want to use mentor texts. So Marchetti and O'Dell say that you need to split up your classroom. So again, we're going back to that idea of having a workshop model classroom. So they say that depending on, how your like the length of your class, those kinds of things will depend on how you split this up. But they say you want to start off with some kind of free write or notebook writing time. You then move into your writing lesson, and then you end with time to write and confer and use what you have learned in the writing lesson in your own writing. And so they give this really nice anatomy of a writing lesson, a way to set up these kind of mini lessons on technique. And so they say, you always want to start with an introduction. Tell the students in clear terms, this is the technique that we're learning. You got to give them a purpose. Why do writers use this? Why is it important? What is the purpose? And then you bring in the mentor text and you're like, woo, look at all these texts that illustrate this technique. And after you go through some mentor texts with them, you ask the students to think about how this technique might benefit them and look for strategic places in their writing where this technique might prove useful. And so that happens during that writing, and they do that. They can look at like what they did in the notebook section. They can look at some of the pieces they're working in class, and think about it there before moving into that writing and conferring piece. And so this is really where you see the mentor texts in action. So lastly, step 6, confer and study patterns in student writing. And so this is like you're teaching and you realize that, Johnny doesn't know how to incorporate evidence into his writing. And so you're like, oh, let me go grab that mentor text by so-and-so who does a really great job of doing that. So this is the anchor question here is, how can I use mentor text to clarify research and push student writing forward? And so they call this the responsive phase. So this is, again, when you're walking around during the end of the writing lesson, during that invitation time, or even later when they're working on their own pieces and they're in that drafting phase. You realize that you didn't teach something fundamental. You maybe realize that a student desperately needs a specific technique that isn't in their toolbox, or you realize that something that was previously taught needs clarification. And this is, they say this is where you have those mentor texts at your disposal to kind of be able to fill this in and be like, oh, this mentor text would be really good at teaching this fundamental item that I realized we didn't teach. Let's put a pause, look at this mentor text so that students know how to incorporate evidence, right? Or know how to introduce a character, things like that. And so that is really kind of the last, that is their last step when developing a unit of study. And so they're basically saying that you kind of need to plan for not the inevitable, but like the plan for the possibility of these things, right? What are some, you're kind of anticipating the needs of your students, kind of, in a sense. And so that's really the last phase of putting together this unit of writing with mentor texts. And as I said, Odell and Marchetti, I mean, these steps, there is so much like this book doesn't look that big, but there is so much information in all of these steps. There are so many examples. They give you a ton of resources that you can use and examples from their classroom. There's just, I could go on and on all day, but I really felt like focusing on how to, create a unit with mentor texts would be the most beneficial. So with these things in mind, with, thinking about how you can kind of, how you use mentor texts, how you could use mentor texts, we'll move into kind of the reflection and discussion piece of this book talk. So some discussion questions that I want you guys to consider now that you have heard about this book. First off, what guides the types of writing you do in your classroom? What considerations do you need to take into account, or have you taken into account in order to create a writing-centered classroom? So like for me, my classroom is not writing-centered. So I would need to think about what I need to take into account in order to create this writing-centered classroom. How do I need to flip things around so that my classroom is more writing-centered? 2, do you use mentor texts in your classroom? If so, share your successes or failures with mentor texts. If you do not use mentor texts, how could you use them in your classroom? So I think this is a really great time to really reflect on your use of these and talk about, be real. Talk about how you use them and, what was successful for you so that other teachers can benefit from how you, from your experiences. I think that this is a really great book to really bring in what we do in our classrooms in terms of writing. And so then lastly, this last discussion question follows along that idea. Think about a text that you love or one that passes a highlighter test. How could you use this text in your classroom as a mentor text? What techniques could you teach through this text? So again, I think this is just a really great opportunity for us to bring in some resources that we could all benefit from. So these are the things I want you to think about and discuss. And I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and ideas and see what kind of text you use or could use in your classrooms. So yeah, see you on the discussion board this week.